The graceful movement of dancers seems so natural and effortless. But like so many actions humans perform, it must be learned. But what is learning? How do we learn? Do our thoughts play a role in the learning process? And if yes, to what extent? No matter how much of a routine we may develop, our daily lives are filled with learning opportunities. Trying out a new recipe, finding a different route home, or acquiring a fresh skill. And for every unique approach we try, there are often new behaviors that must be acquired. In other words, we are always learning. But how does this process take place? In Barbara Noel's dance class, the methods are as varied as the movements.
I teach dance in many different ways because I have a lot of different students that come from a variety of backgrounds. So there's the command style where I say do this, do that. There's the way I just move and have them learn through observation and perception. It's called TPR, Total Physical Response. There's also times where I will just use words so that they learn terminology, dance terminology. So I might say move up stage, doing two chassés into a chaîné, slide into the floor and come up.
4 and slide 5, 6, 7, 8. Two chaînés.
They also learn about spatial awareness in dance. They're constantly moving, thinking about relationship with another dancer or with themselves in space. They have to be connecting with music. So that's a whole nother intelligence, really listening to the music and getting onto that meter and the counts. They have to have movement and pattern retention, remembering directional changes and level changes. They've got to bring something to the dance. It's not just about doing a bunch of steps. So there's all the interpersonal and extrapersonal things where you're trying to communicate something to an audience.
It shouldn't be a moment where you're secure. It should be a moment of insecurity. It should be a moment of excitement because you're going to fall. If you do this, it's not very exciting. But it's exciting to see this fall happening. It's the arc that we're looking for. So
the question of how we learn to dance, or read, or talk, or perform any behavior has long been a topic of interest among psychologists. And with many behaviors that humans can exhibit, it's not surprising that they have identified several ways that we learn.
Good sheet.
In the early 1900s, psychologists discovered two basic types of learning that changed our fundamental understanding of how learning occurs: classical and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning explains how we learn reflexive responses when two stimuli are repeatedly paired. Ivan Pavlov pioneered the study of classical conditioning in his experiments involving the salivation reflex in dogs. He noticed that dogs began to salivate before he fed them. So he did an experiment in which he used a signal whenever the dogs were fed. Soon the dogs began to salivate whenever they saw the signal, whether or not there was any food present. The signal triggered the salivary reflex. This discovery soon became the cornerstone of a new approach to psychology called behaviorism. Many psychologists came to believe that all animal and human behavior is a result of learning through conditioning, with no cognitive processes involved whatsoever. However, other psychologists disagreed.
Robert Rescorla had two groups of rats. In the first group of rats, there were 20 tone shock pairings. In other words, they experienced 20 tones, and after each tone, there was a shock. The second group of rats were a little bit different. There were 20 tones, but instead of there being 20 shocks, there were 40 shocks. In other words, sometimes a tone predicted a shock, and sometimes it did not. Sometimes a shock just came anyway. They did not learn to pair, they did not become classically conditioned to fear the tone because they did not have the tone shock pairings. It was not in a consistent way at all.
These experiments suggest that the rats in the second group could somehow tell the difference between reliable and unreliable signals. Rescorla concluded that this was the result of cognitive processes.
When Rescorla talks about a reliable signal, he's talking about how rats and really all animals learn to associate different events in daily life. Let's just give you an example. When you hear a police siren, you think there's a police car coming, I'd better pull over. When you hear a tornado siren, you look up at the sky. All right. If tornadoes came roaring through and the tornado siren only went off one out of 10 times, you would quickly learn to ignore the tornado siren. It wouldn't mean anything to you. Because a police siren is typically followed by a police car come screaming down the highway, you expect that you come to learn that a police siren is a reliable predictor of a police car coming down the road, and you look for it.
Okay, dancers.
Barbara's dancers know what this signal means, and they react accordingly. But if Barbara were to use a different cue, say clearing her throat, the class would not quiet down as quickly. That's because the cue does not become a reliable signal until the dancers have learned to associate it with a particular meaning. The cognitive processes of thinking and remembering make this association possible. While classical conditioning deals with automatic reflexive responses, operant conditioning deals with how we learn voluntary behaviors. For example, in a dance class, operant conditioning helps students learn to fine-tune their movements.
Yes. Good. Excellent. Okay, again.
A smile and words of praise from Barbara reinforce the action that she would like to see repeated.
Yes.
Operant conditioning, a term coined by noted psychologist B.F. Skinner, explains learning as a process in which consequences shape behavior. For instance, if a pigeon in a box makes a slight turn to the left and is immediately fed, he is likely to turn to the left again. Each time he is fed, the left turn is reinforced. Given enough reinforcement, the pigeon is likely to turn left until it makes a full circle, or 2 or 3. In Skinner's view, operant conditioning did not require mental processes. It is simply the natural response of an animal to an outside reinforcer. Skinner was convinced that most behavioral learning occurs in this way, with no mental processes involved. However, not all psychologists agreed with this view. Two of them were famed psychologist Albert Bandura and his colleague Mike Mahoney. In an experiment that went straight to the dogs, they set out to demonstrate that external rewards alone could not account for all learning, and that internal processes also play an important role.
Mike Mahoney and I decided that we could demonstrate that we could teach animals to be self-regulators. And so they were given full control over those rewards rather than having them dispensed by the experimenter. And then in the true spirit of the Protestant ethic, we taught them that they should work before they reward themselves. So we have a study where a doggy enters a room and goes to an electric typewriter and types, and then goes over to the refrigerator and looks at his big supply of meat morsels and takes only one, and then goes back and does more typing. So this dog really supports a lot of productive activity without anyone being in the room regulating his behavior.
But Albert Bandura was not the earliest psychologist to believe that Skinner's theory did not tell the whole story. Others also felt that mental processes must play a role in learning. The first experiments to explore this were conducted by Edward Tolman, who discovered the phenomena of cognitive maps and latent learning.
In the classical latent learning experiment, animals, rats, were put in a maze and allowed to wander around with no reward, right? No reward. So they couldn't be learning anything according to any kind of a theory that says reward is necessary for learning. They couldn't be learning anything because they're not rewarded. Then one day after they've had a number of trials, you put food in the gold box and you say, now what will they do? Well, what he found is that the next day they behaved just like animals that had previously been rewarded on every single trial. So that demonstrated that learning had occurred, but it was hidden or was latent until it was drawn out by the reward.
Let's watch Elena do that again. Her arms aren't here. Right?
Latent learning is also at work in humans. For example, during rehearsals, a dancer is supposed to learn certain steps so that she can perform her part of the overall routine. However, she may learn the role of another dancer just by watching the repeated performances, even though she receives no reinforcement for doing so.
Okay. How about something they could do better? Okay, let's switch groups.
Dancer A may have no reason to demonstrate what she's learned unless dancer B can't perform for some reason. But if she's asked to step into the new role, dancer A will probably find that she already knows most of the routine. Tolman also found that when he made a change in a maze they had already learned, rats could easily make an adjustment. They had formed a cognitive map of the maze similar to what humans do when finding our way around town.
As you drive through town, you develop not a literal map, but a cognitive map of where you have been and where you're going, and it's this map that you use to do the navigation. If you like, it's an internal representation of the world. That is what guides the person who's driving from work to home in the evening, not the specific contraction of specific muscles in the past, but rather the muscles that may need to be contracted in a particular way at this time because of the map that people have in their head about needing to go from here to there in order to get there.
The principle of cognitive maps can be applied to many situations, including a dance performance.
You may learn how to dance on a particular size stage, and then for another performance, you may move to a stage that has a different size and a different shape. And what can be done is to use this information about relationships, and this relationship information is what is transferred so that performance can be effective. Now, this is done all the time in professional dancers, all the time, because they move from city to city with their dancers, and every place they go has a different size stage, and yet they perform their performances because they can contract and expand because they have this internal information about the relationships in the learning, not just the exact movements.
5, 6, 7, and 1.
Classical and operant conditioning tell us much about the role of direct experience in learning. However, much human learning occurs indirectly by watching and imitating others. This is called observational learning, and dance is a perfect example.
Well, observational learning is a process whereby people acquire attitudes, values, new ways of thinking and behaving by observing the actions of others and the consequences for them. You can waste a lot of time in trial and error, fumbling, and then many mistakes and errors can be highly costly. They could be even fatal. So modeling enables you to shortcut this process by drawing on the competencies around you.
Observational learning, or modeling, begins very early in childhood. Babies as young as 3 weeks imitate tongue movements they observe in adults who play with them. As every parent knows, as babies grow and develop, they will continue to model the behaviors of the people around them. It's important to keep in mind, though, that observational learning is not simply a form of imitation. Cognitive processes are involved.
For example, in language development, people are extracting rules for language rather than just mimicking the sentences they hear. In the case of children acquiring moral standards through modeling, if you do experiments where they're exposed to adults adopting certain standards, peers adopting conflicting standards, and models who preach one type of standard but practice a different kind, the children really have to extract and construct the standard from themselves, from the diverse sources of influence.
Simply observing the behavior of a person does not necessarily mean that observational learning will occur. In fact, there are 4 cognitive processes that interact to make this type of learning possible. First, you must pay attention to a person's behavior.
In a dance class, the very first thing you do is observe.
Toe, turn out, brush, rond de jambe.
I will show the motif or the phrase I'm going to teach, and then the students have to put it into their body. So they're going to need to observe. That's the very first thing they do.
Bump, bump. Okay, here we go. Just watch.
The next step in observational learning requires you to remember the other person's behavior so that you can perform it at a later time.
And brush out.
In dance, it's tough. It's not just reading a page off a paper and memorizing things. You really have to be aware of where the weight is, the directional changes, the level changes. So they're having to retain and take in a lot of movement patterns and remember the transitions into each thing.
From here, bring your arms in front, step back, a little hop.
Next, you have to be able to transform your mental representations into motor skills that can be reproduced.
The third stage is probably the most difficult because watching is joyful and trying to remember it, you're so focused, that's all you're thinking of. But that third stage of actually putting it into your body is hard because the bodies are different. Everybody has a unique and individual body type. And so now they're trying to make what normally, if I choreograph something, it's obviously natural for my body, where it might not be for the student. So now they're having to figure out their own mental shortcuts into how do I get this into my body? How do I not just do the steps, but get the quality that the teacher's asking for?
The final requirement for observational learning is that there must be some motivation for you to imitate the behavior.
I have a built-in motivating factor for the kids already, and that's the end performance. There's always an end performance to what we're working on, and the kids are always videotaped, and they watch themselves and test themselves and correct themselves, and we sit down together and figure out what goals they need to work on. So whether it's in front of a video camera, grading themselves, or dancing in the theater, where it's a 1,500 seating theater, that's pretty ominous for a teenager. And so they, of course, want to do their best. So that motivating factor of a performance at the end is what really is the carrot. It's what pulls them along.
Observational learning helps us throughout the course of our lives, from a child acquiring good table manners to an adult taking on new skills. But what happens after we learn? What determines whether or not we demonstrate our learning? To find out, Albert Bandura conducted his now famous Bobo doll experiment.
In the study, we had an adult exhibited novel styles of behavior, aggressive styles of behavior toward a large inflated doll. The model pummeled the doll with a mallet, kicked it aggressively, tossed it in the air aggressively, and then sat on it and punched it in the face. And these physical activities were embellished with a lot of verbal aggression. We weren't interested in whether kids would hit a Bobo doll, but rather whether they would adopt these novel forms of aggression. After they had observed the model aggression, they then were brought to a room that contained not only a Bobo doll, but a wide variety of other play materials, so the children had a choice as to whether or not they wanted to behave aggressively or not aggressively. And then we recorded their behavior over a long period of time.
Bandura's experiment demonstrates the importance of a key component in observational learning, the role model.
Okay, dancers, today we're really lucky to have Carlos coming back to the fold. He's an alumni of Santa Ana. Some of you guys will remember him. Some of you dance with him. And so he'd like to talk to you today a little bit about dance. Thank you. Let's welcome him.
Hi there again. Sorry. Well, dance has been a very, very big part of me for the past 2 years. It has opened so many doors for me. It has opened just a whole dimension.
When we think of role models, we often think of heroes.
My life in so many ways.
Be it a parent or a peer, a famous athlete or a character on TV, we imitate the actions of people we admire. In many cases, heroes have a positive influence on our lives because they model behavior that is highly desirable in our society.
We're going to do those 4 times. Reach, and melt down. Why don't you guys try it? Okay.
Carlos is one of my ex-students who's moved on to college, and one of the things I try to do in my classes is bring back alumni who are going to college or in companies or out in the world, and it's many reasons. When I bring back students that are in college now, my kids can say, oh, I can do that. I can go on and I can think of a higher education. A lot of my students graduating high school might be the first in their family to do that. So they don't think college. And so this is a great way for them to extend their boundaries of where to go.
I met Barbara Noel actually my junior year in high school, and was my involvement in Guys and Dolls. And I got to work with her, and I auditioned for her dance team. And I danced my senior year in high school, too, with her. 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4. I felt that every time I would see her, she would always inspire me in a way that, I was just, wow, I want to be a dance teacher, too. I want to dance.
Heroes come in many different forms, but unlike Carlos and Barbara, they do not always model positive behavior.
Well, role models provide the substance for observational learning, so these are the patterns that people can draw upon. If the models happen to be exhibiting detrimental styles of behavior and one happens to be attracted to those kind of models, then of course people would be modeling patterns of behavior that could have adverse effects. I think an example here would be the rapid diffusion of terrorist tactics. Airline hijacking, for example, never occurred until the 60s, and then once the style of this terrorist tactic was modeled, it was rapidly diffused across 70 different countries.
Thankfully, not everyone who observes a negative role model will repeat the behavior. In the same way, exposure to positive role models does not necessarily mean a person will adopt their actions as their own.
Each one of you have a uniqueness and talent and spirit. And if dance is what you really desire the most, then love it, enjoy it, and just dance. Just dance.
So, are there factors that increase the likelihood of imitation? In a word, yes.
You'll increase modeling if the model has prestige, is attractive, or has power. So these would be characteristics of the model that might increase the motivation to adopt the patterns of behavior. Another important factor is the functional value of the modeled behavior. Is this behavior that can produce benefits or not? And then, of course, it depends on viewers' sense of efficacy that they can, in fact, master those styles of behavior.
Similarity to the model also increases the chances that observational learning will occur. Barbara Noel uses this in her dance class to great effect.
One of the things I do is I decorate the room with pictures, and all the pictures are of dance students at the school. Some of them are beginning, advanced, or my highest level class. And so when they see that, they have a sense of, I can do it. That could be me up there. And that's another thing that alumni coming back does. It's someone like them that lives in the neighborhood. It's not an unknown, so that there's that connection.
I think Carlos is really inspiring, because he went to the same school as me, and he really just tries very hard, and it kind of makes you think, oh, I can do the same thing he did because he came from my school.
They look at Carlos and they realize Carlos has only been dancing for, now it's probably 3 years, 4 years, and at the last audition at the college, he made it into all the dances. And they're amazed when they see that potential and that growth in such a short amount of time. So I think it makes it more real to them, and the challenge seems less monumental, that they can do it, that they can achieve.
Good job, you guys. Good job.
It influences me to dance better, to try to dance a lot more, not to give up on things, not to let anyone put me down, just to always keep on going.
I find him very inspirational because, like I said before, he's a really good dancer, and that inspires me to even become a better dancer.
When he was giving us a lecture, I noticed, he mentioned that he was a shy person, and I could relate to that. And now I look at him, and I would not have imagined it because he's so confident, and I want to reach that goal too.
Okay, you ready? Yeah. Okay, good. Breathe in, breathe out. Okay, dancers, you ready? Okay, places now and going out right now. Places.
Learning shapes and enriches the human experience. It enables us to share our thoughts, feelings, and talents with the world. And whether we are learning through conditioning or by observing, most psychologists agree that our cognitive processes play an important role in this essential element of life.